I never believed in ghosts. At least, I didn't until I had a terrifying experience that changed my perspective forever. I guess I should start by saying that my life was pretty normal before all of this happened. I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, in an old house that had been in my family for generations. It was a beautiful old place, but over the years it had become a little rundown. Still, I loved it. It felt like home. One night, after an exhausting day at work, I decided to stay up late and watch some TV. My friends had warned me that the house was a bit creepy, but I always brushed it off. Old houses make noises, that's all, I'd say. Nothing to worry about. But that night, something felt different. It wasn't just the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. There was something more, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It started with a whisper, a faint sound, barely audible at first. It was coming from upstairs, and I thought I was just imagining it. But then it happened again, louder this time, like someone was whispering my name. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. But there was no answer. I stood up and cautiously made my way to the staircase. The old wooden steps creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, my eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway at the top. I felt like something was watching me, like something that wasn't human. I tried to rationalize it. "It's just the house," I told myself. "You're just tired. It's probably the wind." But as I stepped into the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the hall, in the doorway of the guest room, there was a figure, a shadow, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. It wasn't moving. It was just there, watching me. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. My heart was racing now. I couldn't breathe. I felt paralyzed, like I was caught in a nightmare I couldn't escape. But then I heard it again. That whisper, only this time, it was clearer. It sounded like it was coming from the guest room. I don't know what came over me, but I felt compelled to walk toward it. As I approached the door, I felt a cold chill in the air, and the whispering grew louder. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, the door suddenly creaked open on its own. The darkness inside the room was almost suffocating, barely see anything. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I spun around, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispering had stopped, and the room was unnervingly silent. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow darted across the room, fast and fluid, almost as if it were trying to hide. My heart raced again, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I turned toward the shadow, but there was nothing there. I tried to open the door again, this time with all my strength, but it still wouldn't budge. I was starting to panic now. I wasn't alone in this room. I could feel it. I could feel something watching me from the darkness, something waiting. And then I heard it. A low growl coming from the far corner of the room. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled backward. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation. I was alone in the house, yet it felt like there was someone, or something, right there with me. I backed up toward the window, hoping to get out, but when I looked outside, all I saw was darkness. The wind howled through the trees, and the sky was thick with clouds. There was no escape. Suddenly, I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. I whipped around, and there at the edge of the room was the shadow again. It was moving toward me. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its movements were jerky, like it was struggling to maintain its form. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, as if I were paralyzed by fear. The shadow came closer, and I could see it more clearly now. It had no face, no features. It was just a black mass, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long, like they were being pulled by some invisible force. The air grew colder, and I could feel the presence pressing in on me. Then I heard the whisper again, only this time it was clear. It wasn't a whisper at all. It was a voice, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Get out, before it's too late." I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare, unable to move or escape. The shadow was so close now, I could feel its cold, oppressive presence enveloping me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow lunged at me, its long fingers reaching for my throat. I gasped, Finally able to move, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the wall. The shadow was right there, its face inches from mine. But there was no face, just an endless void where a face should be. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. But then, everything stopped. The room fell silent once more. I opened my eyes, and the shadow was gone. The door creaked open, and I could hear the wind outside. It was as if nothing had happened. I ran out of that room as fast as I could, down the stairs and out the front door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing for sure. I had never been so terrified in my life. After that night, I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I left and I never went back. The memories of that dark, suffocating presence still haunt me. I can still hear the whispering in my mind, and sometimes, late at night, I feel like it's coming for me again. I don't know what it was that I encountered that night or why it chose me, but I know one thing. I will never forget the feeling of being watched, the terror of knowing I was not alone in that room. And I know that I will never go back to that house.
Next story.
It was a cold, moonless night in late October when everything changed for me. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories, chalking them up to superstition or people's overactive imaginations. That was until I experienced it firsthand. I was in my early 20s, living in a small town in Kentucky. I had just moved into a modest house on the outskirts of town, hoping to enjoy a little peace and quiet after graduating college. The house was old, a bit run down, but it was affordable, and I figured it would do until I got settled in my new job. At first, everything seemed fine. The creaking of the wooden floors was a little unnerving, but I quickly got used to it. The house was a 2-story building with an attic and a basement, both of which I rarely ventured into. The previous owner, an elderly woman, had left behind a few of her belongings, some dusty old furniture, a few paintings, and books. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about the way the old furniture was left behind unsettled me. It was almost as if she had just disappeared without a trace. I remember the first time I felt the presence. I had been sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard something. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping sound coming from upstairs. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling or perhaps a bird tapping against the window. But then it came again, louder this time, a series of quick, deliberate taps. I got up, cautiously walking toward the stairs, but by the time I reached the bottom step, it stopped. I went upstairs, checking each room, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I didn't feel any particular sense of danger, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following night, the tapping returned. It wasn't just tapping anymore. There were footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking across the wooden floors of the attic. I froze in bed, heart pounding. There was no way it could be the wind or the house settling again. This was something else. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the house's plumbing. Perhaps the old wooden beams were shifting in the cold. But deep down, I knew. I had already heard enough to convince myself that I wasn't alone in that house. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Objects would go missing only to reappear in places I didn't remember putting them. A book would be out of place, or my keys would be sitting on a counter I was sure I hadn't left them on. I even began to hear whispers late at night, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But it wasn't until the incident in the basement that I truly understood the horror of what was happening. One evening, as I was doing laundry, I descended into the basement to grab a load of towels from the dryer. The basement was dimly lit, with only a single bulb hanging overhead. As I pulled the door open, a chill ran down my spine. I could feel it, like the air had changed, thick and heavy, pressing in around me. I went inside and quickly started to grab my things. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, there was an old wooden chair facing the wall. At first, I thought it was just another one of the old owner's forgotten things, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The chair was rocking back and forth, gently at first, but it was moving. I could see the faintest outline of a shadow in the dim light, a figure standing behind it. I froze, not knowing whether to scream or run. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. The rocking chair continued to move, faster now, as if being rocked by invisible hands. My mind raced. I backed away slowly, bumping into a pile of boxes, knocking them over. The sound echoed through the basement and the chair stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. I didn't wait any longer. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just a trick of the light or the wind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. That night, the whispers grew louder. I could hear them, like voices coming from the walls, circling around my head. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but they were relentless. They would stop for a moment, only to return with more intensity. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind, a loud crash came from downstairs. I jumped out of bed, rushing to the stairwell. I had to know what was happening. I crept down the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The kitchen was in complete disarray. Cabinets were open, drawers were pulled out, and something had shattered on the floor. I couldn't tell what it was. Glass, maybe? I slowly stepped forward, careful not to disturb anything, but the moment my foot hit the floor, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath. A voice echoed through the house, low and menacing. "Leave. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know where to go or what to do, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I grabbed my things, my phone, and rushed out into the night, not stopping until I was at my friend's house across town. The next few weeks were a blur. I tried to stay away from the house as much as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling me back. I reached out to a local historian, hoping to learn more about the property's history, and what I found was chilling. The house had been built in the early 1900s. The elderly woman who had owned it, her name was Margaret, had lived there for decades. But there was something that didn't sit right. She had disappeared without a trace over 50 years ago, and no one had ever found out what happened to her. The townspeople whispered that she had been driven mad by something in the house. They said that before she left, she would often speak of voices, shadows, and things that weren't of this world. They said she had been a victim of something evil, something that had followed her to the house long before she ever moved in. I thought about Margaret often during those days, wondering if she had experienced what I had, if she had heard the whispers and felt the cold, unseen presence. Had she been a victim of something that was still haunting the house? I couldn't stay away. Despite my fear, I returned to the house, determined to confront whatever it was. As I stepped inside, I immediately felt the change in the air. It was heavier now, thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers started again, softer this time, like a distant lullaby in the back of my mind. But I was ready. I made my way to the basement. This time, I wasn't going to run. I reached for the doorknob and turned it, my heart racing. The moment I stepped inside, everything went still. The rocking chair was gone, but the air felt suffocating, as though something was watching me. And then I heard it. A voice, clear and chilling, right behind me. "You should have left when you had the chance." I turned around, but there was no one there. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, undulating like they were alive. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the basement. I screamed, pounding on the walls, but no one could hear me. It was then I understood. This wasn't just a house. It was a prison. The voices grew louder, and the shadows closed in, pulling me deeper into the darkness. There was no escape.
Next story.
It was the kind of small-town charm that lured people in, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life seemed simple. That's how I ended up in Glenwood, a sleepy little town tucked away in the mountains. It was the perfect escape from city life. Or so I thought. I found an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, vacant and cheap. The place had a history, the kind people don't often talk about, but I didn't care. The rent was affordable, and I was desperate to start over. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time cleaning the house and unpacking, settling into my new life. The creaking floorboards and the dim light streaming through the dusty windows gave the house a certain charm. It was a little worn around the edges, but there was something comforting about it. The town itself was quaint. People waved as I walked down the street, offering me a warm smile or a polite hello. Everyone seemed friendly, but they were also reserved, like they were keeping a part of themselves hidden. It was easy to ignore, though. I had my own things to focus on. It wasn't until the third night that things started to feel off. I had just finished a late dinner when I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. My first thought was that it was just the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. I dismissed it and went about my evening. But then the tapping came again, louder this time. I stood up from the couch and made my way to the window. Outside, the yard was empty, the moonlight casting long shadows on the ground. I peered out, but there was no one there. I sighed, shaking my head at my own jumpiness. Maybe it was just a bird or an animal. I turned away, but before I could sit down again, the tapping came once more. This time, it was rhythmic, deliberate. 3 quick taps followed by a pause, then another 3. It was almost like someone was knocking at the window. My heart started to race. I slowly made my way back to the window, my breath shallow. I pulled the curtain back just a little, enough to see the yard below. There, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, was a figure. A tall, thin man, dressed in a long coat, his back to the house. I froze, unsure of what to do. Why was he standing there in the dark, so still? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching. The man didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. The only thing I could make out was his height, unnaturally tall, and the eerie silence that surrounded him. No footsteps, no rustling, just an overwhelming stillness. I was terrified, but my curiosity got the better of me. I quietly backed away from the window, grabbed my phone, and dialed the local sheriff's office. "Hello? Is someone out there?" I asked, my voice shaky. The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, it's just a local rumor. People around here have been seeing that figure for years. It's nothing to be worried about, though. We get calls about him every so often, but he's harmless. Probably just a prank." "Harmless?" I repeated, my heart still racing. "Who is he? What does he want?" The dispatcher paused for a moment before answering, his voice lowered. "They say he's been seen near the old cemetery, just outside of town. However, some folks believe he's a spirit, others think he's just some man with a twisted sense of humor. Either way, he doesn't hurt anyone. Just stay inside and lock up. He'll go away by morning." I didn't feel reassured. In fact, I felt worse. My grip tightened on the phone and I forced myself to end the call. I didn't know what to think. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was I being targeted for living in the house at the edge of town? Or was there something more to it? I tried to sleep, but the tapping never stopped. It continued through the night, rhythmic and insistent, as though the man outside was trying to get my attention. Every few minutes, the sound echoed through the quiet house, sending shivers down my spine. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, trying to drown out the noise, but it was impossible. By morning, the tapping had stopped. The sun rose, casting a warm light through the windows, but I still couldn't shake the unease that gripped me. I didn't want to go outside, didn't want to see if the figure was still out there. But I couldn't stay inside forever, so I forced myself to step out into the yard. The area around my house was peaceful, as usual. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the birds chirped in the distance. The only sign that something had happened was the faint impression of a figure in the grass near the window. Footprints, faded but still visible. They led toward the woods, deepening the mystery. I spent the next few days trying to forget about what happened. I told myself it was just some strange coincidence. The figure, the tapping, the rumors, it was all just part of the town's weird charm. Nothing more. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I began to notice small things, odd occurrences that I couldn't explain. The lights flickering at random times, the strange drafts that would creep through the house even though all the windows were shut, objects being moved slightly out of place like someone was messing with my things. I chalked it up to being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then came the fourth night. It started with the tapping again. This time, it wasn't just at the window. It was at the door, too. The same rhythmic knocks, 3 short taps, a pause, 3 more. It was the exact same pattern from before. I didn't want to go to the door, but I couldn't resist. I opened it just a crack, enough to see the yard. The man wasn't standing out there this time. Instead, there was a note placed carefully on the doorstep. My hands shook as I reached down and picked it up. It was a single sheet of paper, old and yellowed with age. I unfolded it, the words scrawled in a rushed, jagged handwriting. "You're next." I dropped the note, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping started again, this time more frantic, more desperate, like something was trying to break through. I slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could, but I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop. For the next few days, I did what I could to prepare. I packed up my things, ready to leave, but there was one last thing I had to do. I went to the town's library, hoping to find answers. The librarian, a woman who had been there for decades, was the only one who seemed willing to talk about the figure. "That man," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder as if she was afraid someone would overhear, "he was seen once before, years ago, by another new resident. He was called the Watcher. They say he's not a person at all. He's something much older, something that preys on those who move into the house at the edge of town." I felt a cold chill run through me as she continued. "He waits for the lonely, the lost, and once he's seen you, he won't leave until he's finished with you. No one knows how or why, but you'll know when it's time." I didn't stay long enough to hear more. I ran back to my house, grabbed the few things I had left, and never looked back. I left Glenwood, and I never returned. I still hear the tapping sometimes late at night, even though I'm miles away. And every so often, I see his shadow in the corner of my eye, standing just beyond the light.
Next story.
I still remember the night it happened like it was yesterday. I know it sounds cliche, but it was a typical Friday evening when my life-threatening nightmare. It was just a few months ago, but I can't seem to shake the fear, no matter how hard I try. I was in the process of settling into a new apartment. The place wasn't exactly luxurious, just a small one-bedroom, but it was mine. I'd moved to a new city, far away from my family and friends, hoping to start fresh. The apartment itself had a strange history, I discovered later. It was located in an old building, built in the 1930s, which had been converted into multiple units. There were whispers about the building being haunted, but I was a skeptic. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. It all just seemed like some made-up stories to scare people, especially new tenants like me. That Friday night, I was unpacking boxes and trying to make the place feel like home. The apartment was eerily quiet, except for the sound of my movements. Boxes sliding across the floor, dishes clinking together, and the hum of the refrigerator. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only one alive in the whole world. It felt strange, but I chalked it up to being in a new environment. Around midnight, after I had unpacked most of my belongings, I decided to call it a night. I was exhausted and wanted to get some sleep before tackling more unpacking the next day. I lay in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I thought it was just my nerves from being in a new place, but it was a feeling that I couldn't quite ignore. The apartment was still. Everything was silent except for the occasional creak of the building settling. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to relax, but then I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe coming through a crack in the window, but it was so clear it couldn't have been the wind. It came again. A low, faint voice. It seemed to come from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the voice was growing louder now, as though someone was standing just outside my room whispering my name. "Sarah, Sarah," it called softly. My skin crawled, and my breathing became shallow. I froze, terrified to move, not knowing what to do. I was alone in the apartment, or at least I thought I was. I hadn't heard anyone enter the building, nor had I seen anyone in the halls earlier in the evening. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and quickly checked the time. 12:15 a.m. No one should have been there. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things or if something truly was out there. Slowly, I slid out of bed, making my way to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The moment I opened the door, the temperature in the hallway dropped. It was a stark contrast to the warmth of my room. The air felt thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. I stepped out, my breath visible in the cold air, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The hall was empty. No one was there. I walked cautiously down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The faint whispering continued, though, now sounding as though it was coming from deeper within the building. It seemed to lead me toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. I should have turned back, but something pushed me forward, Curiosity, maybe, or sheer fear of being left with the unknown. As I reached the stairwell, I heard a faint, guttural sound coming from below. It was as if someone was breathing heavily, a deep, raspy sound that made my skin prickle. The stairwell was pitch black, save for the faint glow of a dim light at the bottom. I hesitated, then slowly descended, my heart thudding in my chest with every step. When I reached the bottom, the air grew even colder, and the whispers grew louder. They were no longer whispers, but voices, murmuring unintelligible words, as though a group of people were talking at once. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My eyes scanned the area, and that's when I saw it, an old cracked mirror hanging on the wall in the corner. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it looked out of place. I couldn't tear my gaze away from it. In the reflection, I saw something that froze me to my core. A shadow, standing motionless in the corner, just beyond the edge of the mirror. It was tall, cloaked in black, its face obscured by the darkness. My stomach turned, and the world around me seemed to slow down. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey me. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from above, like something heavy had fallen to the ground. The shadow in the mirror seemed to shift, moving closer. I backed away, my pulse racing, but I couldn't look away. The whispering was now deafening, the voices echoing around me, growing louder, more insistent. I could feel the presence of something behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I rushed up the stairs, my mind in a frenzy. My body was shaking, my legs barely able to hold me up. I sprinted back to my apartment and slammed the door behind me. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear the whispers, now muffled, but unmistakably there. I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, trembling. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow in the mirror. I heard the whispers in my head. When dawn finally came, I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. The days that followed were no better. The whispers continued, always in the back of my mind, always when I was alone. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it was impossible. I couldn't escape it. Every time I went to the stairwell, I felt that cold air, that presence, and I could never get the image of the shadow out of my mind. I asked a few neighbors about the building's history, hoping to find some rational explanation. One woman, an older tenant who had lived there for years, hesitated before speaking. "You don't want to know what happened here," she said, her voice trembling. "This building has seen things that can't be explained. People say the ghosts of those who died here still walk the halls." That's when I learned about the history of the building. It had been a boarding house during the Great Depression, and several people had died there under mysterious circumstances. Some of the tenants had vanished without a trace, while others were found dead under bizarre conditions. The one common thread? They all reported hearing voices, whispers, screams, calls for help, just like I had. I wanted to leave, but the thought of running away from something I couldn't explain terrified me more. I stayed in the apartment, but it was never the same. I kept hearing the whispers, the cold air, and I couldn't sleep. I even started seeing things. A figure in the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows in the hall, doors creaking open when I wasn't around. The last straw came one night when I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. I wasn't dreaming. I knew that. Someone was walking through my living room. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept under the bed and crept out into the hallway, but there was no one there. The apartment was empty, just like it had been when I went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as I locked every door and window in sight. The whispers still linger. I can't seem to escape them. No matter where I go, I feel like something is following me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. I don't know if the ghosts are real or if I'm losing my mind, but I can't live in that apartment anymore. I moved out, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, like they're following me. Maybe they never really leave.
Next story.
I've always been the type of person who enjoys a good thrill. Whether it's hiking through dense woods or exploring abandoned buildings, I've always sought out experiences that make my heart race. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered at the old Jenkins estate. It was a Saturday morning when I first heard about the estate. My friend, Sam, had mentioned it casually during a conversation over coffee. He had grown up in the area and told me stories about the place, how the mansion had stood empty for years, and how strange things seemed to happen whenever anyone ventured too close. He even swore that some of the locals believed it was haunted. Naturally, I was intrigued. I asked him for directions, but he hesitated. I wouldn't go there if I were you, he warned. People who go in don't always come out the same. I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me, and brushed aside his warning. The thrill of investigating the mansion was far too appealing to resist. So later that day, I set off on my own, my mind buzzing with excitement and curiosity. The Jenkins estate was situated on the outskirts of town, nestled between two steep hills. The house itself was massive, 3 stories of crumbling stone and overgrown ivy. It had an eerie charm, but I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of unease as I stepped out of my car and looked up at its imposing silhouette against the gray sky. The front gate was rusted, barely hanging on its hinges. The long driveway was cracked and littered with broken glass and debris, as if no one had tended to it in years. I hesitated for a moment, my feet rooted to the spot, but the thought of the adventure ahead urged me forward. I made my way up the driveway, every step crunching on the gravel. As I reached the front steps, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat, but I pushed the fear aside. This was what I had come for. The interior was even more unsettling. The foyer was vast, with a grand chandelier hanging from the ceiling, though much of it was broken and dust seemed to coat everything. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and the floorboards creaked beneath my weight. I pulled out my flashlight and began exploring. The mansion's silence was oppressive, the only sound being the echo of my footsteps as I moved from room to room. Every hallway felt endless, like the house was a maze designed to disorient those who wandered too far in. I could feel the weight of the air around me, heavy and still, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Eventually, I came to a large sitting room. The curtains were drawn, blocking out any light, and the room smelled stale, like something had been locked away for years. As I stepped inside, I noticed something odd. The walls were lined with old portraits, paintings of people I didn't recognize. But there was one painting in particular that caught my attention, a portrait of a woman sitting alone in a chair, her eyes staring directly at me. There was something unsettling about her gaze, almost too intense, like she was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Her features were sharp, her expression cold, but it was her eyes that unnerved me the most. They seemed to follow me wherever I went. I shook off the sensation and moved deeper into the room, my attention drawn to a fireplace at the far end. It was dark, the stone hearth untouched by time, and the surrounding furniture was covered in dusty sheets. But then I noticed something odd on the mantel. A small, ornate box, its lid slightly ajar. Curiosity piqued. I walked over to it and opened the box. Inside, there was a collection of old trinkets. Nothing of great value, just small, seemingly insignificant items. A pocket watch, a tarnished key, a dried flower. But one thing caught my eye, a ring. It was a simple gold band, though it seemed unusually heavy for its size. As I picked it up, I felt a sudden chill run through me, like an electric shock. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but something was wrong. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard a faint whisper. So quiet, I almost didn't catch it. "Put it back." The voice was low and gravelly, as if it was coming from the walls themselves. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned around, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was no one. The room was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I placed the ring back in the box, my hands trembling. The instant the ring touched the velvet lining, the temperature in the room seemed to return to normal. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and I thought, for a moment, that maybe I had imagined it all. But as I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye again, the portrait of the woman. Her eyes were no longer fixed on me. They had moved. They were now looking at the ring. I froze, my blood running cold. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was clear. The woman in the painting was no longer sitting still. She was leaning slightly forward, her lips curling into an almost imperceptible smile. Her eyes followed my every move, tracking me with an unnerving intensity. The whisper came again, this time louder, more forceful. "Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. My heart raced as I bolted from the sitting room, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I scrambled toward the front door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the house, sending a jolt of panic through me. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the end of the hallway, was the woman from the portrait. She stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light, her hands outstretched toward me as if beckoning me to come closer. I screamed, turning back to the door, pulling with all my might. The woman took a step forward, her presence filling the space between us. Her mouth opened, and for the first time, I heard her speak clearly. "You should never have taken it." With one final, desperate pull, I yanked the door open and ran, not looking back until I was safely outside. The front gate creaked on its rusted hinges as I stumbled down the driveway, my legs shaking from the adrenaline. I never went back to the Jenkins estate. No one I spoke to could explain what had happened that night. The house remained abandoned, its mysteries unsolved, but every now and then, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear faint whispers calling out to me from the shadows, and I can still see her eyes burning into me from that portrait.
Next story.
It was a Tuesday night when it all began, a night like any other, or so I thought. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow through the windows of my house as I sat alone in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. I had recently moved into this old house on the outskirts of town, a quaint little cottage nestled at the edge of the woods. It was far enough from the hustle and bustle of city life, which was exactly what I wanted. The price was reasonable, and the landlord had assured me it had a charming history. But if I had known what history meant, I would have run in the other direction. The house itself had a strange vibe, the kind of place where every creak of the floorboards made you pause and listen a little longer. The walls seemed to hum with some unspoken memory, a story from the past begging to be uncovered. Still, I ignored the oddities, dismissing them as the quirks of an old house. That night, I was deep in my thoughts when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. It wasn't a typical sound. It wasn't the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. This was purposeful, as if someone or something was gently knocking. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. My first instinct was to ignore it, to tell myself I was imagining things. But the tapping came again, louder this time, as though something on the other side of the window was trying to get my attention. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked toward the window, my mind racing. No one lived nearby, and I hadn't seen anyone walking outside for hours. I looked out into the darkness, but there was nothing. The yard was empty, the shadows stretching long across the grass. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started. I stood there, staring into the night, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I saw it, a figure in the distance, near the edge of the woods. At first, it was just a silhouette, dark and indistinct. But as my eyes adjusted, I could make out more details. The figure was tall, thin, and unnaturally still. It stood there, facing my house, unmoving. I squinted, trying to see if it was a person, but it didn't seem quite human. I couldn't breathe. My pulse thundered in my ears. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I wanted to turn away, to shut the blinds and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something, some strange force held me in place. After what felt like an eternity, the figure began to move, slowly, dragging one foot after the other. It didn't walk like a normal person. It was more like a slow, deliberate glide, its movements stiff, mechanical. It came closer, inching toward my house. I took a step back from the window, my heart racing. The figure was now in the yard, just a few yards away from the house. I could see its face now, and I regretted it instantly. It wasn't a face at all. It was smooth, featureless, like a blank white mask. The eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck the light around them. I gasped, stumbling backward as its head turned toward the window, its gaze locking with mine. I couldn't look away. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other through the glass. It felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only a few minutes. Eventually, it stopped moving, standing perfectly still just a few feet from the window. And then, as if it had made up its mind, it began to step toward the house. I turned and ran. I didn't think, I just acted, fleeing into the hallway and slamming the door to the living room behind me. My hands shook as I locked every door in sight. The house felt suffocating, the air thick with dread. I sat in the dark for hours, trying to convince myself it had all been some strange, unsettling hallucination. But deep down, I knew better. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. I kept expecting the figure to appear at my window again, but it never did. At least, not physically. That's when the voices started. At first, they were faint, whispers just on the edge of hearing. They would come when I was alone, sitting in silence. The whispers would surround me, coming from all directions, too soft to make out the words, but undeniable in their presence. Every time I would turn around, the room would be empty. The voices never stopped, though. They grew louder, more insistent. It was as though they were speaking directly to me, trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand what. Began to feel like I was losing my mind. I couldn't escape the whispers. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just beyond the edges of my vision. And then, one night, the whispers turned into something else. I was in bed, lying wide awake, when I heard it. A knock at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock you hear from someone asking to be let in. It was slow, deliberate, like something with purpose was knocking on the other side. I got up, my hands trembling, and walked to the door, trying to steady my breath. When I opened it, no one was there. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes scanning the empty rooms. But there was something different this time. The air was heavier, colder. The whispers were louder, more urgent, like they were right behind me. I felt something brush against my shoulder, cold as ice. I spun around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, yet the oppressive feeling of being followed lingered in the air. And that's when I saw it. Standing at the end of the hallway, just before the staircase, was the figure. It was the same one from the yard, the same blank, featureless face. It was staring directly at me, unmoving, its hollow eyes boring into mine. This time, it didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I remember running, but I don't know where I went or for how long. I remember the house closing in on me, the walls tightening, the whispers becoming a deafening roar in my ears. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape it. The next morning, I woke up on the floor of the living room, my body stiff and bruised. The house was quiet, too quiet. I slowly stood up, my heart heavy with dread. The figure was gone, but the presence of something dark lingered in the air, something watching from the shadows. I packed up my things that day and left the house for good. I didn't tell anyone what happened, and I've never gone back. But every night, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, the tapping on the window, and I know it's waiting for me somewhere in the dark.
Next story.
It started out as a typical weekend trip to the countryside. My friends and I had rented a cabin for the weekend, a small, rustic place in the woods. It was the kind of getaway we needed, away from the noise and stress of city life. There were 5 of us, and we all piled into my car for the drive. The road to the cabin was winding and narrow, lined with tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It wasn't long before we found ourselves deep in the woods, far from civilization. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked even older than we expected. It was a log cabin, weathered by time, with a large stone fireplace and a porch that overlooked a small, murky pond. The windows were dusty, and the porch swing creaked in the breeze. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, but it had a certain charm. Still, something about it felt off, but we didn't let that spoil the excitement. After all, we were here to unwind and have fun. The first few hours were perfect. We unpacked, lit a fire in the fireplace, and cracked open some beers. We laughed and told stories, the sound of our voices filling the quiet of the woods. But as night began to fall, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when we first noticed the noise. It started out as a faint scratching sound, like something was scraping against the side of the cabin. At first, we thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but then it grew louder, more insistent. The noise seemed to be coming from all around us, as though something was circling the cabin. I went to the window and peered out into the darkness, but all I could see was the silhouette of the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. Nothing moved, no sign of any animals. I turned to my friends, but they all looked just as uneasy as I felt. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded. The scratching sound had stopped, but there was an eerie silence that filled the air now. It felt like the whole world had gone still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "Maybe it's just the wind," another friend said, trying to shake off the tension. "Old houses creak, and the trees could be rubbing against the walls." But I wasn't so sure. There was something in the air, a heaviness, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. It wasn't like anything I'd felt before. We decided to go to bed, hoping that a good night's sleep would help us shake off the strange feeling. I settled into my bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises, soft, whispering sounds that seemed to echo in the darkness. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a voice. It was faint at first, like someone calling out in a whisper, but then it grew louder. It sounded like my name. "Sarah," the voice called. I froze. I knew no one was supposed to be out there. My friends were all in the other rooms and the door was locked, but the voice didn't stop. It called again, more urgently this time. "Sarah, come outside." I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but something deep inside me was telling me to go out there. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was dangerous. But the voice, it sounded so familiar, so convincing. I crept to the window and peeked outside. The moonlight barely illuminated the yard, but I could see the faint outline of the trees, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky. And then I saw something moving. At first it was just a shadow, but as it moved closer to the cabin, I realized it was a figure. A person, walking toward me, their face hidden in the shadows. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. There was nothing but darkness. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I stepped back from the window, my hands trembling. I rushed to the other room, waking up my friends. "We need to leave." "Now?" I said, my voice panicked. They all groggily got up, but when I explained what I saw, they just laughed. "You're imagining things," one of them said. "It's just the stress of being out here. You're scaring yourself." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. We didn't get any sleep that night. We stayed up, talking quietly, listening to the unsettling sounds coming from outside. It was as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching us. At dawn, we decided to pack up and head home. As we loaded the car, one of my friends pointed toward the pond. "What's that?" she asked, her voice shaky. I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. At the edge of the pond, standing motionless, was a figure. A woman, her back turned toward us. She was wearing a long, tattered dress, and her long, black hair hung down over her shoulders, obscuring her face. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stared at her, unable to look away. Then, as if sensing our gaze, the woman slowly turned toward us. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, like two hollow sockets. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She just stared at us, her expression unreadable. I felt the ground beneath my feet shift, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice trembling. We didn't wait. We scrambled into the car, slammed the doors shut, and sped off down the narrow road, not looking back until we reached the safety of the nearest town. When we finally stopped at a gas station, trying to collect ourselves, I asked the attendant about the cabin. "That place?" he said, his face going pale. "It's been abandoned for years. No one's lived there for decades. People say it's haunted." "Haunted?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yeah," he continued, his voice low. "There's an old story about a woman who lived there years ago. She was driven mad by something in the woods. Some say she still haunts the place, calls out to people, lures them in." I didn't know what to think, but after what we'd experienced, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't just a story. We never went back to that cabin, and I never spoke about it to anyone again. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that woman standing at the edge of the pond, staring at me with her hollow eyes. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to come too close.
Next story.
I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but after what happened to me, I can't deny it anymore. My story starts in the most ordinary way, with a move to a new apartment in the city. I had just graduated from college and landed a job at a marketing firm. I found an affordable apartment in a building that was old, but seemed perfectly livable. The kind of place that feels like a hidden gem in a busy urban sprawl. The rent was cheap, and it was close to work, so I took it without much hesitation. The apartment was on the fourth floor of a tall gray building. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. It wasn't the decor, it was the feeling in the air. The rooms were dimly lit, even in the daytime, and there was a heaviness that seemed to linger in the corners of every room. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the fact that I was new to living alone. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The first couple of weeks went by without incident. I settled in, unpacked, and started my new job. Life felt busy, and I didn't think much about the odd atmosphere in my apartment. But then things started to change. It started with the sound. At night, after I would turn off the lights and settle into bed, I began to hear soft thumps like footsteps coming from somewhere above me. At first, I thought it was just the neighbors, but the sounds didn't seem right. They weren't footsteps on a floor. They sounded like they were coming from the ceiling, slow, deliberate, as if something or someone was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it at first, but it persisted night after night. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing, wondering if I was just imagining things. But it wasn't just the sound. There were other things. Small things, but unsettling nonetheless. One morning, I found the bathroom door wide open, even though I knew I had closed it the night before. Another time, I found my kitchen faucet running when I was sure I had turned it off. These little unexplainable occurrences began to pile up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I came home late and found a strange chill in the apartment. The heat was on, and yet the air felt icy. I shrugged it off as the old heating system acting up, but when I went into the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, in the middle of the room, was a dark, wet stain. It wasn't there earlier in the day. I hadn't spilled anything. I knelt down to inspect it, and it smelled wrong. It was a metallic scent, like rust or iron. I recoiled in disgust and wiped it up with a rag, trying not to think about what it could be. But the smell lingered and the stain wouldn't fully come out. I decided to go to bed early that night. But when I turned out the lights and pulled the covers over me, I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I was wide awake, staring into the darkness when I heard it. A voice. Low, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Get out. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I thought I must have been dreaming. But the voice didn't stop. It came again, this time louder, clearer. Get out. I shot up in bed, my pulse racing, and looked around the room. There was no one there, but the air felt thick, oppressive, like something was right next to me, watching me. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called the building superintendent. When he arrived, I told him about the strange noises and the odd occurrences. He listened, his face turning pale, but he didn't say much. He simply nodded and said, "I'll take care of it." I figured he would send someone to check the pipes or the electrical wiring, but when he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. And that night, things only got worse. The footsteps began again. But this time, they were different. They were closer, louder, as if someone was walking around inside my apartment. I got up, my legs shaky with fear, and checked every room, every closet, but there was nothing. No one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The mirror in my bedroom had fogged up. It hadn't been that way when I went to bed. But now, as I looked into it, I saw something that made my stomach churn. In the fogged up glass, there was a message written in what appeared to be smudged fingerprints. Leave this place. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I wiped the fog away, but the message didn't disappear. It was still there, as clear as day. And then, for a brief moment, I saw something in the reflection, a shadow standing behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing. I rushed out of the apartment and spent the night at a friend's place. The next day, I went to the building superintendent's office again, determined to get answers. This time, he didn't brush me off. He was different, more serious. "I should have told you before," he said quietly, his voice shaking. This building, it has a history, a dark one. I waited for him to continue, my stomach sinking. Years ago, he said, a woman lived in that apartment. She was troubled. She heard voices. She claimed the place was haunted. She even left messages, just like the one you saw in the mirror. She disappeared one night without a trace. No one knows what happened to her. Some say she was driven mad by whatever is in that building. Others say she never really left. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and left that day, vowing never to return. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I still can't get the image of that shadow out of my mind or the sound of that whispering voice. It's been months since I left the apartment, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear it. The faintest whisper, just at the edge of my hearing, saying, "Get out." I don't know if it was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. There are places in this world that are better left undisturbed. And some things, no matter how hard you try to forget, will never let you go.
Next story.
It was a quiet Tuesday evening when I found myself driving down the winding road that led to the old farmhouse on the edge of town. I had been meaning to visit for weeks. A friend had told me about it, how the place had been abandoned for years and how it had been subject of local rumors. Some people said it was haunted, others claimed it was simply a place that time had forgotten. I wasn't one for ghost stories or urban legends, but something about the house intrigued me. It was the kind of place that seemed to call to you, even from a distance. The kind of place you couldn't ignore, no matter how hard you tried. As I approached the house, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field that stretched out before it. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, its broken windows and peeling paint giving it a weathered, almost mournful appearance. But there was something about it that felt alive, as if it had a story to tell, one that needed to be uncovered. I parked my car near the rusted gate that separated the house from the rest of the world. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and overgrown grass. The front steps were cracked and uneven, and the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to enter. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. The floors creaked under my feet as I made my way into the hallway. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, the patterns barely visible through years of neglect. The house felt abandoned, yes, but not entirely empty. It was as though it still held on to the memory of its former occupants, its past lingering in every corner. I walked through the rooms, taking in the remnants of what had once been a family home. Old furniture sat covered in dust, photographs framed on the walls, each one telling a story of a life once lived. The further I explored, the more I felt an odd sense of connection to the house, as if it were somehow pulling me deeper into its mystery. I made my way upstairs, the wooden steps groaning with each step I took. The hallway at the top was narrow, with doors leading into rooms that were untouched by time. I opened the first door on my right and stepped inside. It was a bedroom, though little more than a shell of what it once was. The bed frame was still there, though the mattress had long since rotted away. A few pieces of furniture were scattered about, covered in sheets that had turned yellow with age. But what caught my attention was a small wooden chest sitting in the corner of the room. I felt an overwhelming urge to open it, as if it held something important, something that I needed to see. The latch was stiff, but after a few attempts, it opened with a faint creak. Inside, I found a collection of old letters, yellowed with age and tied together with a faded ribbon. I pulled them out one by one, carefully untying the ribbon and unfolding the fragile pieces of paper. The letters were written in neat handwriting, though the ink had faded over time. They spoke of love, loss, and longing, of a family separated by circumstances beyond their control. But it was the last letter that stopped me cold. It was dated nearly 50 years ago, written by a woman named Alice. She spoke of something that I could hardly believe, a dark presence that had haunted the house for generations, something that had been passed down from one family member to the next. She described strange occurrences, whispers in the night, objects moving on their own, and a feeling of being watched at all times. But what chilled me the most was the final line. "It's coming for me, just as it came for the others. I can feel it, even now, and when it comes, it will take me away, just like it did before. The letter was signed Alice, with no mention of her last name. I sat there for a long time, staring at the letter in my hands, trying to make sense of what I had just read. Was it all just the ramblings of someone who had lost touch with reality? Or was there something more to it? Something that went beyond what I could understand? I stuffed the letters back into the chest, suddenly feeling a coldness in the room. I wasn't alone anymore. The air around me seemed to thicken, and I felt a presence, something watching me from the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my breath caught in my throat. I turned to leave, but as I did, I saw something move in the corner of the room. A figure, faint but unmistakable, standing by the window. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But then it moved again, stepping out of the shadows and into the pale light filtering through the broken window. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her clothes tattered and torn. Her eyes were hollow, lifeless, yet they seemed to stare directly at me, as if she could see into my very soul. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure took a step toward me, and I felt the temperature drop in the room. It was as if the very air had become suffocating, thick with a sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. "Leave," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Leave before it's too late." I didn't wait to hear another word. I turned and bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran to my car, hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, but I could feel it. Something was watching, something was waiting. I drove away. The image of the woman's hollow eyes burned into my mind. I didn't look back. The next day, I returned to town and spoke to a few of the locals. They didn't know much about the house's history, but they all had one thing in common. They all seemed to know about Alice. She had been the last person to live in the house, they told me, but she had disappeared without a trace shortly after writing that letter. No one had ever found her, and no one had ever dared to live in the house after her. The rumors about the house's dark past began to make sense to me now. Alice's warning echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken her was still there, still waiting for the next person to wander too close. I haven't been back to that house since, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear her voice, faint but clear, calling out to me from the shadows. Leave before it's too late.
Next story.
I had always prided myself on being a level-headed person, someone who didn't buy into the superstitions or tales of the supernatural that plagued my small town. That was until I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house had been vacant for years when I found it. I had been looking for a place to start fresh, and this old farmhouse, nestled among rolling hills and dense trees, seemed like the perfect escape. The realtor had warned me about the house's history, something about strange occurrences, but I had shrugged it off. People always tell spooky stories about old places. It was part of the charm, or so I thought. The first night I spent there was uneventful. The house creaked and groaned as it settled, the wind howled through the trees outside, and the usual sounds of a house at night filled the air. I was used to that. But around 2 a.m. I woke to a strange noise, a soft, dragging sound coming from somewhere deep within the house. I froze, listening. It was unmistakable, a dragging, scraping sound that seemed to be getting closer. I was too exhausted to get up and investigate, so I pulled the covers tighter around me and tried to convince myself it was just the house settling again. But when I woke up the next morning, there was a faint, dusty trail leading from the back door to the kitchen. It looked like something, or someone, had dragged something heavy across the floor. There were no animals in the house, no signs of a break-in. I shrugged it off, telling myself I must have imagined the noise, but the unease lingered. The following nights were worse. The dragging noise became more frequent, always around the same time, 2 a.m. It was as if whatever it was had set a schedule. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just the house, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I began to hear other things too. Whispers, faint and indistinct, as though someone was talking in another room. But when I checked, the house was always empty. There was no one else. It wasn't until I noticed the marks on the walls that I truly began to feel the terror creep in. At first, it was subtle scratches, small gouges in the wood as though something had clawed at it. But then the scratches grew deeper, more pronounced, until it looked like something had been desperately trying to break through the walls. I called in a local contractor to check it out, thinking maybe there was an animal trapped somewhere, but he found nothing. The walls were solid, no hidden tunnels, no evidence of anything. He assured me it was just the age of the house, maybe some dry wood expanding and contracting. But I knew better. Then, one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the hallway outside my bedroom door. I was frozen with fear, too terrified to move. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, listening, praying that whatever it was would go away. But then the door handle began to jiggle. Slowly at first, as if someone was trying to open it without waking me, and then more forcefully as though they were trying to get in. I leapt out of bed, heart racing, and grabbed the nearest object I could, a lamp, and I slammed it against the door, desperate to stop whatever was on the other side. The door handle rattled violently for a moment before stopping, and the footsteps faded into silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I gathered up my things and called the realtor. I was done. There was something in that house, something I couldn't explain, and I wasn't going to wait around to figure it out. The realtor wasn't surprised when I told him. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. He told me the house had a history of strange occurrences, but they never lasted long enough for anyone to get too scared. He mentioned the previous owner, an older woman who had passed away unexpectedly in the house. She had been found in the kitchen, her body cold and stiff, as though she had been sitting at the table, waiting for someone, waiting for something. No one knew what happened to her, but they said she was a bit eccentric, always talking about the things in the walls and the voices that follow her. He said I wasn't the first person to have strange experiences in that house, and I definitely wouldn't be the last. The house, it seemed, had a history of drawing in people who were sensitive to whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I packed up my things, I glanced one last time at the old farmhouse, its windows dark and silent. The dragging noise hadn't started again, but I could feel it. Something was still there, something that had been there long before I had arrived and would be there long after I was gone. I never went back to that house, and I never spoke of it again. But every so often I find my finding of the old farmhouse, wondering if it's still waiting for its next occupant. If it's still waiting for someone to hear the whispers, to follow the dragging noise, to discover what lies hidden in its walls. But one thing is certain, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the terror that I felt. The terror that still haunts me to this day.